The ODSTs are one of the most badass factions of the Halo universe. This is owed in no small part by the awesome battle armor that they wear and the ridiculous manner in which they enter the battlefield, climbing into human entry vehicles, otherwise known as single-occupant exo-atmospheric insertion vehicles, or SOEV drop pods, and being quite literally fired at a planet from orbit. I've done a most detailed breakdown on the ODST battle armor, and I've done a most detailed breakdown on the ODST Drop Pod, both of which I strongly recommend for any ODST fans out there, and both of which are linked in the description down below. But just as I've addressed the Spartan augmentations and different platforms of Mjolnir in most detailed breakdowns, and then done another video exploring as to whether or not these kind of augmentations or armors are actually possible, and whether or not we have real-world analogues that could be used in their place, it's time that we give that same treatment to ODST equipment. So to kick this off in a two-part series, let's look at whether or not the ODST Drop Pod is actually possible with modern technology. Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00, and just a little reminder, I am currently neck deep in expanding the type of content that I generally do, so if you're looking for the same kind of style of content but with other universes and other games, head over to the 00 Multiverse, formerly known as the Lawcore Multiverse, and make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss that content coming up. For content more orientated around me just talking about whatever the hell it is that takes my fancy at any given time, usually focusing in on science, technology, engineering, mathematics, philosophy and metaphysics, alongside the big questions of life and death and highlighted discussions from our weekly Discord chats, head over to the 00 Lounge. And if you're just looking for a bit of ambience to chill, relax, fall asleep to or to study, head over to Ambient Wonders. Beneath all my videos you'll find my Teespring store, which gives you a pretty tasty selection of Halo-themed merch and apparel. Links to all the social media, including the Discord, can also be found in the description, alongside links for all the previously mentioned channels. And if you want to be one of the awesome individuals who's making sure that I can continue to make this content full-time, head over to Patreon and become a patron for tons of Patreon-fulfilled merch, some merch fulfilled by myself that's usually made by awesome creators across the community, and some looks into behind the scenes, as well as monthly Patreon game nights. Thanks for sticking with me while I shamelessly plugged myself. Now let's get on to the content that you're here for, whether or not an ODST Drop Pod is actually possible. So first and foremost, is it possible to have a vehicle that can be in space and reinserted into an atmosphere while keeping the occupants within alive? No, of course not. We've never even been to space. The International Space Station is just an excuse for the government to unnecessarily spend money. The moon is an artificial alien space station, and the Earth is flat. God, could you actually imagine if I was like that? This is currently one of the easiest parameters to answer, as we already have space vehicles that can re-enter the atmosphere with occupants inside. The vessels can maintain an atmosphere inside, have control systems for maneuvering of whatever vehicle that might be, and most importantly protects the occupant from the heat of re-entry. But this is actually an interesting point of note. Generally speaking, in order for a space shuttle, for example, to re-enter the atmosphere of Earth, a very precise insertion corridor must be chosen. If the angle of attack of the space shuttle is too steep upon entering the upper atmosphere, the heat that is generated as a consequence of impacting the atmosphere at such a high speed, generally speaking, will make the space shuttle overheat and break up. However, if the angle of attack is too shallow, the space shuttle can skip off of the atmosphere and end up careening into deep space. So these insertion corridors were chosen specifically to hit the atmosphere at just the right angle so as to be able to penetrate down into the deeper layers of the atmosphere while also not thermally loading the space shuttle's airframe too substantially. And it was these precise parameters that led to the specific sets of ablative heat shielding and thermal soaks that were used on the space shuttle's outer hull. For the purposes of a drop pod, these materials wouldn't necessarily tick all of the boxes. The drop pods could in theory be launched from a ship at the right angle of attack to match that of the space shuttle, but based on our in-game observations of orbital insertions taking place alongside the lore written in the books, it is generally the case that the drop pods are looking for the fastest possible entrance into an atmosphere so that the ODSTs contained within can be deployed to the battlefield as fast as possible. This suggests a much higher angle of attack, basically a straight shot into the atmosphere, and thus requires significantly more impressive heat sinks and thermal soaks. The black tiles on the space shuttle were refractory insulation known as Li 900 tiles, which were a reusable surface insulation tile that could become extremely hot on one surface but be only warm to the touch on the other. This would protect the space shuttle's airframe from too much heat, that could lead to a weakening of the airframe and breaking up of the space shuttle. The issue with these tiles, however, is that while they are reusable, they're not particularly strong as far as material properties are concerned. In fact, they break up very easily. However, the black tiles on the space shuttle weren't all made of this. There were a few positions on the space shuttle that needed particularly high protection from heat because they were the leading edges of the space shuttle during its insertion. As such, a wholeheartedly more impressive material was required, and this came in the form of a material called Circa, also known as silicon impregnated reusable ceramic ablator. And this material was particularly impressive because it was the only material that could be machined to custom shapes and then applied directly to the spacecraft. There was no post-processing, no heat treatment, and no additional coatings required, unlike many of the other tiles used on the space shuttle. They were extremely lightweight, performed extremely well as regards to material properties in compressive loading, and could tolerate temperatures up to 2000 Kelvin, all while the inner surface would only become warm to the touch. On top of this, another material known as carbon reinforced carbon, also known as reinforced carbon-carbon or just simply carbon-carbon, which is a composite material consisting of carbon fibre reinforcements in a matrix of graphite. This material doesn't stand up quite as well as Circa in regards to its mechanical properties, as this was one of the particular panels that failed with Shuttle Columbia. One of the carbon-carbon panels was struck by a piece of polyurethane foam travelling at hypervelocity. This was enough to breach the panel entirely and allow extremely hot atmospheric gases to find their way into the interior spaces of the shuttle's airframe, ultimately leading to its destruction. The properties of these two materials tick most of the boxes required to ensure that a drop pod could reach the ground without burning up in the atmosphere, but we've still got another one to look at. Phenolic impregnated carbon ablator, otherwise known as PICA, was a material developed by NASA in the first instance, but was improved upon significantly by SpaceX. This particular iteration of the material, known as PICA-X, is 10 times cheaper to manufacture than the NASA's original PICA, and further improvements still were made to become PICA-3, which improved upon material's properties, ablative capacity, and further reducing cost. This material would more than sufficiently protect a drop pod from the heat of re-entry. The drop pod also has a crash cage at the bottom of the pod. This crash cage is designed very similarly to the crumple zones of cars, and are basically areas that are designed to crumple, bend and deform during an impact, thus absorbing the kinetic energy of the impact over a greater period of time. Again, we developed this into modern day cars, so that's very much in the boundaries of possibility as well. The drop pod also features a drag chute, which is basically just a canopy that opens once it's deep enough in the atmosphere that the heat of re-entry is no longer an issue, and it creates immense drag as the atmosphere passes around this drag chute. This decelerates the drop pod dramatically. But the final thing that takes the edge off for the ODST and ensures survivability are the retro rockets. These are basically short burn rockets that are activated based on the altitude above the ground. These rockets activate and dramatically reduce the falling velocity of the drop pod to tolerable levels so as not to kill the occupant, but also still fast enough of an impact to mean that they're not hanging in the air for too long. Well, we've seen demonstrations very similar to this in recent years from SpaceX in regards to their rocket boosters that can self-land. Even the blunt shape of the drop pod itself creates a shockwave ahead of the pod itself, which means that the actual heat of re-entry isn't directly in contact with the hull itself, but rather the shockwave keeps a distance between the heat of re-entry and the hull, again reducing just how much heat the airframe of the drop pod takes. In fact, to reference SpaceX once more, the Crew Dragon capsule could be considered as a modern-day three-man drop pod. The long and short of this is basically that drop pods are absolutely possible with modern technology. We would basically just be downsizing something similar to the Crew Dragon capsule, implementing slightly better heat shielding and ablative coatings, building a crash cage onto the underside to take that little brunt of force off of the impact, attaching a hardened drag chute and retro rockets to decelerate, and ultimately that ticks 99.9% of the boxes. There are obviously some guidance systems built into it that allow the pod to be marginally directed in its descent, but again, this is fully within the boundaries of possibility. In my own personal opinion, I'm not exactly sure why we haven't looked into this a little bit more extensively in regards to our emerging commercial space enterprise. So far, accidents in space have been decidedly little. For example, generally speaking, the ISS has had very few in the way of emergency circumstance that have caused any great concern substantial enough to warrant evacuating the current attending crew. But the reality is, this is now a numbers game. Commercial spaceflight is becoming much more common, and as it does, the possibility of accidents happening in space become ever more likely. At this stage, there's really no rapid way to evacuate crew from the International Space Station or other space-borne constructs. Now, don't get me wrong, there probably are contingency plans in place should this circumstance ever occur, but I'm surprised there isn't a more built-for-purpose solution to evacuation as we continue to move into the commercialization of space. I for one think it would be extremely achievable and very impressive to actually have a module attached to the International Space Station that has several Soev Drop Pod type human entry vehicles attached to it that perform exactly the functions that we've outlined here for a drop pod from Halo, but stand ready should, or rather when, they'll be needed. If NASA or the European Space Agency or SpaceX or Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic want to reach out and discuss this, hell, if Red Bull wanted to reach out and discuss this, I'd be willing to have the conversation. For a price, of course. But ultimately, the reality of the situation is this. The technology that would be required in order to build a human entry vehicle or a drop pod from Halo already exists 100%. We could build a drop pod right now, today, with the right funding. And indeed, I would argue that we should be building something like this for the sakes of evacuation, as the inevitability of there being accidents in space that would require rapid evacuation from a construct in orbit around Earth will become unavoidable as we continue to increase our presence in space. So now's the time to have a contingency built and ready, and there's no way more badass to return to Earth than going feet first into hell. Thanks for watching. If you're new here and liked what you saw, go ahead and hit that like button and hit the subscribe button while you're at it so you don't miss my future uploads. Links are in the description to get connected and jump into the Discord community with me, and if you really love the content I'm making, consider supporting the channel over on Patreon for tons of awesome perks. Pop your comments down below if you have an idea of what I should cover next, and hang around for the end of the video for other suggested videos you might be interested in. Huge shoutouts to my patrons: Spartan10148, the Metarch of my installation, Falcon, Prophet, Phantom, Thomas, Mikhail, and Irrefutable Justice, my monitors, Andrew, Cameron, Darian, Flaming Halo, Madness, Masked Owl, Michael, Spartan0137, The Cave Potato, Uwu Master, and Wolf Eclipse, my sub-monitors, my growing fleet of Strato Sentinels, my ever-vigilant Enforcers, and all the other awesome patrons that are helping to support the channel in a big way. Huge shout out to Todd Morrison for keeping the installation powered with that glorious vacuum energy. Much love to you all. Take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.